Can God fail to speak to us? I think that's a fascinating question because in my most recent video, I played this. I said this, and I want to play it for you real quick. It's just 11 seconds. But just for 1 minute, I want us to consider that when God seems silent, it could be that he is speaking, and we need to grow in our ability to discern his voice. Or in other words, God can speak, but not quite be heard. And I think that's interesting because it produces a kind of tension in us, something that maybe we're not used to thinking about. And so there is a legitimate criticism of that way of thinking. And I found this video online called God Doesn't Whisper by a pastor named Jim Osman. And he has a critique of that kind of position, that God can speak, but not quite be heard. Here, this is what he says.
What does this say about God, that he is trying to communicate, but he needs us to tune into his frequency so that the communication can be successful? Let me suggest something. God doesn't try to do anything. God does. God never tries to do anything. He either does not do it or he does it. But what does it say about God to suggest that he is attempting to communicate, but he's having difficulty doing so unless you tune into his frequency?
I think that's a good question. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this live stream today. Am I suggesting by saying that we can put barriers between us and hearing from God, that God can fail? God can fail when it comes to speaking to us. Okay, before we dive into that, I want to talk to you about Truth Snack, and I want to welcome you. Truth Snack exists to help doubting Christians become adventurous truth seekers so that they can believe with confidence. If you are someone who is going through doubt or deconstruction, this is a place where I want to journey with you on your pilgrimage and help you come to a place of confident faith. And this year on Truth Snack, we're talking about all the different ways that we can encounter God, and how an encounter with God can actually be something of an anchor that can ground us even during times of faith. And so we're talking about encountering God from a bunch of different angles. And throughout the year, we're going to talk about a bunch of different ways in which we can encounter God under the umbrella of encounter. So just a few days ago, I put out my second large video in that series, talking about how we might have to remove barriers in our lives from actually being able to hear God. And part of that video, I invited viewers like you, whether you'd be 100% in on actually opening up your life and inviting God into your life. Inviting God into your life every single day. Because in that video, we talked about how an invitation transforms our attention and our intention. And so when we invite God into our lives, it transforms our attention to his presence and our intention to respond. So this viewer just 12 hours ago said, I'm 100% in. They've committed to inviting God into their life every day while we go on this journey of adventurous truth seeking and try to learn about encountering God so that our faith can be anchored even during times of doubt. And so I invite you, it's not too late, it's never too late, to start living your life in such a way that you actually invite God into your life so that it can transform your attention and your intention, and accept that you need to grow, that we all need to grow to be more like Jesus, who is perfectly in tune with God. The last thing I want to say before we jump into what it is we're talking about today in this live stream is just to say, if you ever have any comments or questions, pushback on anything that I'm saying today, I invite that in the comment section. In fact, I deeply desire your input and to go on a journey of adventurous truth seeking together. And so I'll just say that many of my videos are scripted. This video is not. I've prepared, but I'm kind of doing theology with you. And so I invite you to share your thoughts and your questions, your comments, your feedback, so that we can actually have a conversation about this theology together. I welcome that. Okay, so am I suggesting that God can fail when it comes to speaking to us? Because what Jim Osman said in his video, it sounds really good, right? God doesn't try. He does or he doesn't do, but he definitely doesn't try because God can't fail. Well, I think what I would say is that I would never say that God is failing. I agree with him on that. But I think there are some things God won't do, and this might be even a little bit more uncomfortable. I think sometimes there are things that God can't do. And that might make you feel a little uncomfortable. And that's okay. If that makes you feel uncomfortable, I understand that, and I even understand where that's coming from. What we're going to do to kind of warm us up to this idea that there are some things that God can't do is we're going to actually watch an old school Truth Snack video, which I released on February 5th, 2019. So I'm pretty excited to play this video. It's got like the old intro on it, the old logo in it. It's very exciting. So I want to just share this with you, and we're going to talk about it. The video was called The Omnipotence Paradox. Can God do anything? Let's watch that together.
The Omnipotence Paradox asks, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? It's a little tricky because either God can't create an unliftable rock or he can't lift it. So in this video, we're going to discuss whether the Omnipotence Paradox attacks the common Christian belief that God can do anything. That's coming right up. You know, I never paid much attention to the Omnipotence Paradox until one day I met a high school student who didn't believe in God because of it. And to be fair, if this paradox does show that an omnipotent God is an incoherent concept, then it actually is a good reason not to believe in God. So does the Omnipotence Paradox dismantle belief in God? Well, no, and this is why, and you might need to brace yourself for this, but there are some things God can't do. And if you think about it for a second, Christians have always believed that there are some things God can't do. He can't lie, he can't cease to exist, he can't create logically impossible things like a square circle. What does that even mean? And God can't create anything greater than himself, and that includes rocks, no matter how big they are. And that's because God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable thing. I mean, for fun, you can think of all kinds of things that God can't create as the greatest conceivable being. He can't create a cheetah so fast that he can't catch it, or a cup of coffee so hot that he can't drink it, or a book so long that he can't read it. Okay, one more little thought experiment. What would happen if an unstoppable force met an immovable object? Which one would win? Well, it's actually impossible to say because the question is nonsense. An unstoppable force and an immovable object can't both exist simultaneously. And it's the same thing with an omnipotent God and an unliftable rock. They can't both exist at the same time. So when we're asked the question, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? The simple answer is no. An unliftable rock can't exist, and that's because God is omnipotent.
All right. So maybe that's a new thought for you, this idea that there are some things that God can't do. He can't do things, I wrote them down here, that go against his very nature. Like he can't cease to exist. He's an eternal being. He can't lie. He can't do things that go against his nature, but he also can't do things that are completely incoherent. He can't, what was the example? He can't create a square circle because that's an incoherent thing. He can't create a rock so big he can't lift it because an omnipotent God can't exist in a universe and there can't be an unliftable rock in that same universe. That's an incoherent thing. And so there are some things God can do and there are some things God can't do. So in the past video that I just posted a few days ago, we talked about the idea that God could burst into our lives. And sometimes he does burst into our life, kind of the same way he did in Paul's life, where the Apostle Paul, he burst into his life and made himself obvious. But also God might not burst into our lives. He might come and gently knock and wait for us to open the door. So there are different ways that God can come and reveal himself to us, but there are also other things that he can't do. For instance, he can't force us to love him. And that's why I showed us that video about the Omnipotence Paradox, because it's an incoherent concept that you can force someone to love you. That's turning them into a robot or a puppet. Love has to be chosen. It's something that we have as a free will that God has given us because of our free will. And so it's incoherent, this concept that God could force us to love him. So it goes against, it's an incoherent concept, but it also goes against his nature. God doesn't want to beat us into submission, into a relationship with him. He wants a reciprocal relationship where we're in a loving, conversational, back and forth relationship with him as Heavenly Father and his child, okay? So There are some things when it comes to our relationship with God that God can't do. But I wouldn't say that God is failing. Okay, so I even wrote this down because I wanted it to be really clear. I would say it just like this: God is successfully offering a relationship that we can freely accept or reject. So God isn't failing, but he has chosen to exist in a relationship with us where he's going to offer us relationship, but we have the option, the possibility, because he's given us free will to actually accept that or reject it. And so that might mean that sometimes God speaks and it actually requires discernment, or we could actually ignore it. And that might make you feel uncomfortable because you're used to this. I know God is all powerful. God can do anything, but God can't force us to love him. And so maybe that makes you feel uncomfortable. But I would say that that's something that is going on in your heart, that you might feel uncomfortable with the idea that hearing God requires discernment, or that he can be ignored. And you might think that feels so inefficient. How is it that God can do something and be ineffective? He could be ignored or require discernment, and we could not discern his voice properly. We want God to be clear cut and dried, easy to hear. So it might feel inefficient. It could feel unclear. It might even feel foolish and weak. God is trying to do something and we're not listening to him. He's trying to say something and we're not listening. That could feel foolish and weak. But there's a really important piece of scripture that I want us to read together. It says this: Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And really should put like bunny ears, air quotes around these words. For the foolishness, bunny ears, of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness, bunny ears, of God is stronger than human strength. Well, why do I bring that up? Because the scriptures themselves make it really clear. The Apostle Paul makes it clear that God dying on a cross might sometimes, and to some people, seem like foolishness. It might seem like weakness, but don't miss this. It's very effective in bringing about the kind of relationship God actually wants with us. So the cross might seem weak, it might seem foolish, but it's very effective in bringing out the relationship God actually wants with us. And so when we hear that God is speaking, and that requires discernment, and it actually can be ignored, that might seem foolish and like weakness to us, but the scriptures show us that's our God. Our God can sometimes act in ways that we think is foolish and weakness. So it might seem like foolishness and weakness to us, but get this: it is very effective in bringing about the relationship that God is actually interested in. God is gracious in persisting in pursuing us and offering invitation in order for us to freely respond to him in love. And so if we think it sounds weak or it sounds foolish, this is God living in such a way that he believes will actually bring about the kind of relationship he's eager to have with us. And so we might not like to hear that. In order to discern God's voice, we might have to grow in the hospitality of our heart towards God. And we might actually have to grow personally in maturity and humility. And if that's the case, can I just suggest that maybe what's going on is that we actually still have an infocentric view of Christianity? If you don't know what I mean by that, I've been talking about it a lot lately. This is a thumbnail from a video that is called "What Exact Beliefs Make Me a Christian?" If you want to hear more about what I mean by infocentric Christianity, then I invite you to go find that video. In brief, infocentric Christianity is a Christianity that is based on information instead of relationship. In the video that I just put out last week, I had to edit it down like several times because in my script I just kept saying, and here's another instance in my life where I was living an infocentric version of Christianity. I was a pastor who was able to teach doctrine, but I didn't actually expect to encounter God. Information, but not relationship. I would often pray to God, but I just wanted information about my future, but I wasn't actually that keen on having a relationship with God. It's so easy for us to think We want God to offer information when he speaks to us, but hearing from God is less about information and more about transformation, transforming us to have the kind of relationship God wants, one where we respond freely and out of love to his ongoing calls and invitation to us, one where we actually need to grow like Jesus in discerning God's voice, and that we need to actually grow in our maturity and humility so that we are attentive to God's presence and intend to actually respond to it. So, one last thing I want to talk about. Just before we take off for this video, I wanted to share with you all that I'm already working on next month's video where I want to talk about hearing God through the Bible and kind of bring it into this framework of encounter that we're discussing. And so I'd really love your thoughts on this question. How do I hear God through the Bible? I think we have lots of assumptions about what it means to hear God and that we should hear God from the Bible. But if I was brand new to following Jesus, what is it that you would tell me in order to help me know how to hear God through the Bible? Any input you give on this topic and on this question will really influence the video that I end up making. And I would love your input as we go on this journey of adventurous truth seeking together. Thanks so much for jumping in today. If you have any comments or questions, let me know below, and I'll see you next time.